Actually, since the beginning of the war in Syria, the Turkish side supported the Islamist so-called rebels. So on the northern belt of the Syrian geography, the Islamist fighters had their positions and they targeted the Syrian civilians in that part. Therefore, the Kurdish ethnicity in that part of Syria, they hold arms in order to protect themselves against these Islamists, because the Islamists consider the Kurdish ethnicity as an infidels, and the Kurds between 2011 and 2014, they were getting arms, ammunition and support from the Syrian government until the Syrian government was no more able to support the Kurdish militias in that side, because the Syrian government itself was forced to withdraw from northern Syria, especially from Raqqa, from Hasakeh, from Qamishli, in exception to very few spots, and they withdrew towards the south. And therefore, after that, the Kurds relied heavily on the American support, and by relying on the American support, they got also sophisticated weaponry, and they had a strong military presence on the borders with Turkey. And as we may know, during the last decades, there were a lot of problems between the Kurdish PKK fighters and the Turkish army or the Turkish successive governments. And the PKK and the YPG, that is on the northern border of Syria, they have a strong presence now. So Turkey thinks that the Kurds fill the vacuum now, the ISIS vacuum in northern Syria. They have to kick this Kurdish strong military presence from the northern borders more into southern side, or basically 40 kilometers away from the Turkish let's say borders, and by doing so they think that they have to create the so-called safe zone. This is from the Turkish perspective. However, from the Damascus perspective, they see this as an social or ethnical engineering, because the Turkish side, they want to expel the Kurdish militias, not only the militias but also the population from that side, including other ethnicities such as the Assyrians, the Armenians, the Christians and Arab other clans. And by doing so, they want to replace these people with the refugees. And this is no more a secret. Even the Turkish side is acknowledging the fact that they want to resettle hundreds of thousands of refugees from Turkey into Syria that could mount into 2 million refugees. And by doing so, that means they want to change the demographics of that area. And by changing the demographics of the area, they want to export more pro-Turkish refugees from Turkey into Syria and to resettle them there. And in my opinion, this is similar to 1939 scenario, when the French mandate the occupation, when they withdrew from Liwa Iskenderun, the Iskenderun area, and they allowed the Turkish army to fill that vacuum, and they held a so-called referendum, which was very vague, and they captured the Iskenderun. So in my opinion, Turkey could also do the same, repeat the same scenario, and occupy northern Syria by organizing a referendum in the next couple of years after resettling the refugees in northern Syria. Actually, the agreement between Pence and Erdogan is really problematic, because we have to address this from the international law perspective, or the international law angle, because the American presence in Syria is illegal and the Turkish presence in Syria is also illegal. So two illegal forces on the ground, they're making agreements on the fate and the future of a geography that belongs to Syria, Syrian people and the Syrian government that is responsible for this side of Syria. In my opinion, Turkey, by starting the military operation, they forced the United States into negotiation once again, because the United States was not happy by the Turkish aspirations in Syria, especially against the Kurds. But after the start of the military campaign and the huge lobbying and the pressure on President Trump in the United States itself, that they say that Trump betrayed the Kurds in Syria, it seems that there is a win-win situation now between the United States and Turkey. And that means Turkey will create a 40-kilometer safe zone in northern Syria, according to this agreement. And the United States will ask the YPG, or the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, to withdraw from this belt into the south. Here comes the problem. The problem is the United States will leave what is in the hands of the Kurdish militias. That means after 40 kilometers that the Kurds stay to have their own autonomic power, their own autonomic army, and their independent, their institutions there. And at the same time, they will give their NATO partner the right to have a military presence in northern Syria, and by doing so, as I mentioned, Turkey will do an ethnic engineering there. They will replace the population, and they will create new realities underground in order to change the demographics and settle the pro-Turkish people there. Now we have to talk about what Syria is doing, because Syria, or the Syrian government, the Syrian army, they send reinforcement into north and northeastern Syria, into certain areas such as Manbij and other towns. And Syria is basically trying to minimize the damages at the moment and to try to cut geographically cut or stop the Turkish expansion in northern Syria, because the Turkish excuse is that since the borders with Syria is occupied by the Kurdish militias and they consider these militias as terrorist organization, then they have the right to intervene. But if these borders are controlled by the Syrian government, the Turkish side will not have the excuse in front of the media, in front of in diplomatic corridors. So let's see how things will develop, because it's really interesting to see how the Syrian government will react after this agreement, because yesterday President Assad, on Thursday, he said that he vowed to resist the Turkish occupation with all legitimate means. And in my opinion, the Syrian side, they are very professional in emptying or creating holes or poles in such agreements, and they can in the future, in my opinion, it will take a lot of time, but they can empty this agreement from its value, and they can create holes in this agreement, and they can make agreement with certain Kurdish militias and create rift among the Kurdish militias and attract some part of them on its side, and also some Arabic clans, and create a popular resistance against the Turkish president. And this will cost Turkey a lot, and it could be such a Vietnam, like a Vietnam for Turkey in Syria. The agreement between Pence and Erdogan states that the Kurdish militias, or the SDF and the YPG, should withdraw from this safe zone after 5 days. In my opinion, this is realistic, because the United States will ask the SDF to withdraw, and this is really unfortunate situation in my opinion, because only a few days ago the Syrian government made some military arrangements with the SDF, that both sides, the SDF and the SAA, meaning the Syrian Arab Army, they were able to repel the Turkish occupation of the Syrian lands. But until this moment, and unfortunately, the American side has a strong leverage over the SDF, because they empowered this military organization in northern and northeast Syria. And it seems that till the moment that the SDF will withdraw from this territory and stay in the oil-rich side, mainly in Deir ez-Zor and other areas, in order to have a big share of the oil and energy sources in Syria, and not to give the Syrian government the chance to make reconciliation and to fight together against one enemy, which is for them now the Turkish occupation of the north. Only after hours of the agreement, the Turkish forces are still bombing the northern Syria, and they violated the cessation of hostilities. And Turkey is very clear that this is only, they want to halt the operation and not to stop it. And they could find any excuse to continue this operation against the Kurdish militias. But at the moment, Turkey will be satisfied in occupying 40 kilometers in depth in Syria and create a so-called safe zone. to clean this area from heavy armament of the Kurdish militias, and then send back almost 2 million refugees into this geography. This is a very dangerous game, and in my opinion, Turkey is willing to implement this agenda, and they have the backing now of the United States to do it. Unfortunately, the Europeans, they don't have a leverage and they can't do anything in this regard. The rebirth of ISIS is always possible because its presence is not only physical but ideological, and as long as the Wahhabism exists and the Muslim Brotherhood ideology exists, that means a lot of people from the Islamic world will be brainwashed and they will be radicalized and later will be a terrorist, a potential terrorist. In my opinion, those who are held hostage now in Kurdish prisons and could be handed over to the Turkish side, there could be certain agreements, especially for the European or other multinational terrorists with their governments, to hand them over to their governments and to be imprisoned in their own countries. Some countries, they don't want to accept these prisoners, so there should be a regional and international agreement in this regard. However, the escaped ISIS terrorists, they could find a refuge in the deserts of Syria. It's a very huge desert and they have already sleeping cells there. And even the Syrian army is not able to chase every single terrorist in the desert. So regrouping ISIS is possible, but not into extent that ISIS could pose a huge threat as it used to do in 2014 and 15. It could have a small power and could make some damage and pain to all sides in Syria. But in my opinion, that ISIS Frankenstein of 2015 and 16 is over, and it's in our back. And now what we really should care about is the regrouping of the former so-called moderate rebels that Syrian government bust into Idlib and Jarablus, and now they are fighting under the Turkish flag against the Kurdish militias and other ethnicities in northern Syria. And these people, they are not so different from ISIS. They fight for the same cause, basically, but they have more moderate names and some fancy flags that unfortunately some Western governments call them moderate rebels. But in my opinion, if we now follow the Western mainstream media, we will understand that even the media is now talking about this formerly known Free Syrian Army as radical maniacs, and they are really concerned that these people are genocidal and they will they will do atrocities against the Kurds. While the same fighters, when they were doing these atrocities, committing these atrocities against the Syrian government, the Syrian army soldiers, they were called moderate rebels. It's not in the interest of the Syrian army to have a direct clash with the Turkish occupation forces in northern Syria. However, the Syrian government is able to organize a popular resistance in that part against the Turkish presence. Till the moment, it doesn't seem that Turkey also has an interest in clashes with the Syrian government. However, what the Syrian army is doing, they are deploying their forces in certain main cities in northern Syria, especially in the cities, and they are raising the Syrian flag. And by doing so, they are having a military presence, even in medium and heavy artillery, in an area that is designed as safe zone between the United States and Turkey. So, as I mentioned, Syria is creating holes in the agreement between the United States and Turkey, and they will try to slow down the implementation of this agreement until the conditions are changed, because the Syrian government is playing on the time. They are betting that time could change the conditions and they could have a better, let's say, solution or a better stronghold in northern Syria. And in my opinion, at the end of the day, the Syrian government will do its best to stop this agreement for implementation. Not that the Syrian government doesn't want the refugees to come back, but what really concerns Damascus is a strong Turkish military presence in northern Syria. As I mentioned, social engineering in that part, Turkification of North Syria, and later to capture that area as they did with Iskenderun, which is called now Hatay. So for Damascus, this is a really dangerous game, but they don't really make big statements, they don't make reactions, they work silently in this regard, and I believe the upcoming years will be very decisive for northern Syria, and at the end of the day, as long as the Assad is in power, I believe he will do all he can to hold this agreement and create holes in this agreement, and at the end of the day to have redeploy the forces of the Syrian army in northern Syria, so that means Turkey will leave Syria. Syriana Analysis is an independent news and analysis platform. Please don't hesitate to support the channel through Patreon, an online sponsorship platform that enables me to create more content to you. Link in the description below.